right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Last video lesson, we briefly went through what the aggregate demand curve looks like and what causes aggregate demand in an economy to shift. SparkNote's version, it's mostly consumption, but the government and investment spending also play a role in it. Now, we need to look at the other side of the coin now, and we need to look at the aggregate supply model, right? And so we're going to take a look at the aggregate supply curve, and the aggregate supply curve illustrates how much GDP, real GDP, would be produced at the varying levels of prices in an economy. Now, micro level concept again, as the price levels increase in the economy, you'll notice the production levels increase, right? Because the profit motive, the profit effect, just like on the micro level. So that results in that upward sloping curve. But what you'll notice here is that over time, what happens? It becomes vertical, right? It's not a necessarily like a aggregate supply, or excuse me, on the micro model, that supply curve, which I drawn like this, right? It's much more curved up, right? And so why is it that we have the aggregate supply curve here? Why is that portion nearly horizontal? And then the question we'll also answer is, why is this portion nearly vertical? Right, and so we're going to kind of go through this and understand what shifts in aggregate supply curve and how this relates to total production, and our PPC also will come back into play here. So we'll start by talking about the things that shift aggregate supply. And a lot of these things that shift aggregate supply are going to be very similar to the things that shifted our micro model supply curve. Right, so we'll just draw price level, real GDP, and just for the sake of it, that's our aggregate supply curve. Now, so the first thing that will shift our aggregate supply curve is the cost of inputs, right? This is your main influence, meaning if the cost to produce your product goes up, you're going to be able to produce less. Now, this is, again, a micro concept, but we extrapolate this out to everything in the economy. So a main influence on this would be oil prices, right? Oil being the most important, one of the most important inputs in anything, because it's either used in the actual production of the energy, the actual product, the transportation, or the packaging, or whatever it is. It's oil is factoring into literally everything that you consume. And so when oil prices change, that's going to change the amount that each producer of their product is going to be able to produce, right? So this best example of this would be the OPEC crisis of the 1970s, right? So OPEC says no oil to you, United States. We get an embargo. The amount of oil available to us decreases substantially, which causes aggregate price levels across the economy to shoot up, and because of a shift in the aggregate supply curve to the left, right? Now, right now, I just was at the getting gas today. Gas prices are $2.09, right? So because of the decrease in demand and the weird war between the Russians and the OPEC nations about oil prices, oil is dropping through the floor. And if we didn't have the state-mandated lockdown, then you could see producers of products taking advantage of those cheaper prices and increasing their supply. Fortunately, we're not seeing that because of the other problems in our economy, right? But that would cause a rightward shift. Number two, a change in labor or productivity. So if you as a worker are more productive, let's say, Gab can produce 100 socks an hour, and then whatever we change the incentive structure, and I say if you can increase your production by 25%, then you will get a $5 an hour raise. Well, that's going to make Gab work much harder and thus shift her output to the right. Aggregate that out across all workers, you're going to have a massive increase in productivity, and you're going to be able to get short-run bursts of supply. Now, the other way would be if workers become lazier, less efficient, and Gab can't produce 100 anymore, she can only produce 50 in an hour. Well, the labor cost has stayed constant, but her her value in terms of that labor has dropped precipitously. So that would shift us to the short run aggregate supply one. Also increases in labor pool, so larger populations or increased maybe H-1B visas, people coming in from the United States, outside of the United States to work here. Excuse me. Number three, which is kind of pertinent right now, a natural disaster, right? So our productive capacity hasn't necessarily dropped during this COVID-19 crisis, right? We've lost people to the disease, but not in aggregate numbers large enough to have a long-term impact. But in the short run, what is everybody doing? If you can't telecommute, you're not working right now. You're sitting at home watching Netflix and eating bonbons. All right, if you're a retail worker like my mother who works at Kohl's and who the Kohl's is closed indefinitely right now, you are not being utilized, so you're sitting home. That is going to be a short run problem. Now, when the economy turns back on and people are allowed to go back to work, then you should see that our shift to the left has been temporary. Now, will we regain all of this lost territory overnight? Probably not, because a lot of businesses are not going to be able to hold on for much longer and will go bankrupt and close, right? So I saw a story this morning about AMC movie theaters might not make it through this because they were running a pretty bad budget beforehand. And now that they've been closed, they very well may not reopen, right? So we may lose some of this productive capacity, but most of it should return. Number four, taxes, right? So corporate taxes, just like you, impact a corporation's disposable income. And what they can do with that disposable income is typically reinvest it in their company to produce more product, hire more people, produce more stuff. Right. So if the government lowers the corporate tax rate like it did back in 2017 from 35% on corporate tax to 21%, that frees up a lot of productive capital that was getting siphoned away from production. So the businesses can, in theory, take that money they're now not having to pay the government and hire 50 more workers, buy a new factory, reinvest in themselves, which then should allow for a rightward shift in your supply curve. If we jack taxes back up, then that's going to redirect resources away from production and towards the government, which doesn't allow them to produce as much, which causes a short run aggregate supply curve shift to the left. And the last one, a change in regulations. So if we get rid of certain regulations, and you've been seeing a lot of those regulations going away right now, right? Like I know in certain states they're allowing for delivery of alcohol. I think across the country they've gotten rid of this concept called certificate of need. And so the certificate of need is a regulation when it comes to building hospitals. So a certificate of need is, let's say another private hospital system wanted to build a hospital on the other side of Doylestown. In order for them to get approval to build a hospital, Doylestown Hospital, our current hospital, would have to sign what is called a certificate of need, saying we do need another hospital in this community. Now, the problem with that is that Doylestown Hospital is a private hospital driven by profit. So in order for this new hospital to enter, their competition needs to allow them into the space. And so that creates an artificial restriction on supply. And so right now they've gotten rid of that because they're trying to make it as easy as possible for people suffering from this horrible corona to get the treatment they need, and so they're getting rid of that certificate of need, right? So if they change emissions regulations to make them more harsh, safety regulations, all of those regulations are going to cost the businesses more money to make sure that they're compliant with it, or to figure out ways to actually make their product compliant with it. That's going to cause their ability to produce their product to decrease. But as you get rid of those regulations, now we're not accounting for the externalities like climate change or health or whatever, but this is a cold economic statement. If they got rid of all those regulations, we cut that red tape, then that's going to allow the producers to produce their product much more efficiently, cheaper, quicker, and then getting us more of those products. So let's talk about the short run aggregate supply and the long run aggregate supply. So the short run aggregate supply is essentially what the producers can produce over the next 6 months, we'll say, right? And so, but over time, that short run turns into the long run, right? So the short run is kind of a snapshot of what our economy can produce now, and the long run is what the economy can produce, what we'll say as at full employment. Remember that phrase. So we kind of want to break down this curve into 3 sections. All right. So this first section here, which I will highlight in blue, is what we're going to call the Keynesian portion of the model. So Maynard Keynes was an economist during the Great Depression. He's the guy that gives us real GDP. Keynesian economics is the underlying economic principles that bring us things like the New Deal and more government involvement in the economy. He has become more important in the next part of this unit. So you'll notice in this blue portion, we're not seeing a lot of change in price levels, right? So price levels here, say Y1, PL1, and versus price levels here at PL2, Y2, indeterminately different. So it's marginally different, maybe not even different at all. And the same thing here at PL3 and Y3. Price levels are staying relatively constant, but the output is growing at an exponential rate. The reason that is that at the lower end of our graph, we are highly underutilizing resources here, right? So the cost pressures, the cost of production pressures aren't kicking in on this part of the graph, right? Because we may still have, let's say at Y2, let's say we still have 20% unemployment here. With 20% unemployed, there's not going to be a lot of pressure from workers to get wages to go up because there's still a lot of people out of work, right? The scarcity principle hasn't really kicked in yet, right? There may be a bunch of, let's say you're a home builder, a bunch of lumber that is still still waiting to be bought, and so there's no upward pressure by lumber producers to charge higher prices, right? So at this lower end, as the economy, let's say we'll add in the aggregate demand curve again. Right, so as the demand curve starts to pick back up, we're not going to see much upward pressure on prices. Now, as we move further down the supply curve, and we'll highlight here, I'll do this one in red. Apologies, I'm not great at this drawing garbage. You'll start to see the curve is curving, right? And that is the hybrid portion. So the hybrid portion is where we start to actually feel the scarcity impact more. Right? So instead of 20% unemployment, let's say at PL4, we're now at 10%, right? And so the available labor pool has gotten tighter, so the wage pressures have gone up, or the price for lumber has gone up, or the price of petroleum has gone up, and that's causing the cost of production to go up marginally. And so now you're starting to see output is slowing down a little bit, but the price levels are starting to kick in, right? And so let's hop over to the next slide and we'll take a look at the vertical portion, right? And so this last part of the graph, levels, real GDP, is this portion, right? And so what we see here, as the scarcity effect is really starting to kick in, the high levels of output have caused price levels and cost of productions to rise tremendously as businesses attempt to gobble up the last available resources. So maybe at, let's say, this part right here, price level 6 and Y6, this unemployment rate may be, let's say, 3.5%. There's so few workers left that they can't increase their productive capacity because there's not a lot of people to hire. And so, but those workers now are so in demand that they can bargain for a higher wage. So now the businesses are getting the same amount of production per worker, but at a higher price point. Right? So instead of $8 an hour, it's now $10 an hour, but they're still only getting 100 socks. So what does that do? That puts pressure on the aggregate price level, and it has no real impact on the aggregate output model, right? Because then if we go up to price level 7, price level is now the thing that's increasing, but look what's happened to output. Output is staying at Y6. And so as that scarcity effect kicks in for the producers, we see the curve become vertical, and then we can say that we've kind of arrived at our long run aggregate supply, our productive potential, right? And so let's talk a little bit more about the long run aggregate supply, right? So the long run aggregate supply is vertical at full employment, right? So if our economy is operating here at AD1 and Y1, then our economy is operating at full employment. It is operating at its productive capacity. It is at its potential. So all of these words should sound familiar because this is all kind of similar to our friend, the PPC. Right? So it is vertical because the economy self-adjusts, right? So as a higher price level, they're going to be accompanied with higher production costs. So in the long run, there's no incentive to increase production to just because you get a higher price, right? Because the output isn't going to increase. All right, or your price, your return on investment isn't going to increase because the cost pressures are too high. So brings me to wrap it up here is the only way that we can get this curve to shift, right? Because our potential is constantly changing, right? This is not an anchored output, right? Our productive capacity in 1900 is a heck of a lot smaller than our productive capacity in 2020, right? And so you want to kind of think of these two graphs or these two portions of the graphs as similar, right? That the PPC, which was our productive capacity, our potential output, this curve is similar in almost every way to this curve. So if our resources increase, we find new oil, better renewable energy. We find a better, cheaper, more efficient way of producing it through technology. Our workers get smarter, faster, more efficient. Their productivity increases. All of those things increase the PPC to push our boundaries out of what is possible. That same idea would shift our long run aggregate supply. Right? So this is our goal of where we want to be. That's what we want to be as close to the operating on our long run aggregate supply as possible. But that curve is always constantly shifting because the amount of resources we have, how we use our resources, the efficiency of which using those resources, and the productivity of our workers is constantly changing, right? So very rarely will you see your productive capacity decrease. All right, so if this is our model here. Right. Very rarely will you see this long run shift to the left. You would have to have a major natural disaster, something like an earthquake in Haiti, right, which destroys the infrastructure, destroys the roads, the bridges, the factories, the cars, the people, right? Something like that. That is pretty much the only way that you would see your long run aggregate supply curve shifting to the left. What we are operating in right now is much more akin to this, right? So you could say, sorry, lots of labeling. you could say that prior to COVID-19, we were probably somewhere in the region of here. We were near full employment. We had 3.5% unemployment. We had 2.5% real GDP growth. We had price levels that were stable. We were very nearly at our long run aggregate supply, at nearly our near potential. Then COVID comes, shuts down the productive capacity. Um, and so right now we're not seeing much change in price levels except for particular goods, right? So the aggregate price level in the economy probably hasn't changed much. You see toilet paper and like certain food products going up in price just because of the demand. But in other areas, price levels have dropped substantially. Like the home prices, I think, have dropped 22% nationally over the last month, which again is good for me. But so it's the aggregate price level hasn't probably changed much, but our aggregate demand has, right? So aggregate demand being the driver of which being consumption, we can't really consume if we're stuck at home, so we're dropped down here. Now, if our casualties from this are much more substantial than we think, then maybe we can see a shift in this, but I don't believe that's where we're going to see it go over the next couple of months. All right, so it's a lot of information I jumped in there with you. If you have any questions, you know where I am. Otherwise, you know, safe and wash your dirty hands, you filthy monsters.